Good morning, Professor and classmates. Today, my groupmates and I will be presenting on the 2004 Madrid train bombings. Our presentation will cover what happened, the immediate effects, and the cause and further effects of the crisis. We will also be looking at the emergency response measures and the political office holders' response measures, followed by our overall evaluation and ending with the lessons learned. So, what happened in Spain in 2004? Well, on 11th March, 3 days before Spain's general elections, 10 backpacks filled with improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, exploded on 4 separate passenger trains in and around Atocha station in the city centre during a busy morning rush hour. All 4 affected trains were travelling on the same line and in the same direction. The attack, also known as 11M, killed 193 people and injured nearly 2,000 others. 3 other bombs did not detonate as planned and were later found intact by the police. A Spanish court found 21 people guilty of involvement in the bombings, but this is not including the 7 other suspects who blew themselves up when police were closing in on them. The attack was initially attributed to domestic terrorist group ETA. In the months leading up to the 11M attack, the Spanish government had indications that pointed to ETA's intention of carrying out a major attack in Madrid. These indications included a few attempted terrorist attacks within the city. The day after the attack, an estimated 11 million people participated in nationwide demonstrations against the violence and in support of the victims. However, this display of unity began to break down as evidence mounted that the ETA was not responsible for the attack, but rather an extreme Islamist militant group thought to be working in the name of Al-Qaeda was. Traditionally, ETA issued warnings prior to its bombings. However, as evidenced by the carnage, there were no warnings for the 11M attacks. Furthermore, elements of the attack bore Al-Qaeda trademarks, such as synchronized explosions, mass casualties, economic targets, and strategic timing. Additionally, the attacks came precisely 30 months after 9/11, following a noted pattern of terrorist groups choosing to strike on days of significance to them. Lastly, the day before Spain's general election, the incumbent government continued to blame the ETA for the attack. This was while the police had received a videotaped statement from an individual claiming to be Al-Qaeda's commander in Europe, taking responsibility for the attack. Spontaneous protests broke out in cities all over Spain, where protesters were demanding to know the truth of the attack before they voted in the elections. Before moving on, it is important to know Spain's political climate at the time. Spain's 2 main political parties were the Partido Popular, aka People's Party, and the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, the PSOE. The PP were the ruling party and made up the incumbent government. They were led by Prime Minister Aznar. They were the main support for the US-led invasion of Iraq. However, surveys had shown that nearly 90% of Spaniards opposed this support. The PSOE, on the other hand, was the main opposition party, led by PM candidate Zapatero. The PSOE had an anti-war stance and strongly opposed Spain's involvement in the Iraq invasion. The Islamic connection in the attacks put Iraq back on top of the political agenda. Okay, the main cause of the attack was identified as Spain's involvement in the war in Iraq. As mentioned earlier, 2 days after the attack, the Spanish authorities received a statement from an individual claiming to be Al-Qaeda's commander in Europe, declaring that the attack was punishment for Spain's involvement in the US occupation. Further investigations into the bombing also led authorities to the jihadist web forum Global Islamic Media, which had posted a memorandum assessing the perceived vulnerabilities of several democratic governments that were contributing troops and resources to the global war on terrorism. It labeled Spain as the domino piece most likely to fall first in terms of degrading international support for the US occupation of Iraq and foreshadowed the fall in the Spanish people's support for their government if significant civilian casualties were to be experienced, as Spain's initial decision to be involved reflected Prime Minister Aznar's sentiments and not the people's. This provided further proof that the cause of the bombings was retaliation to Spain's involvement in the Iraq War. Now moving on to the further effects. The day's event demonstrated European vulnerability to large-scale terrorist attacks. It resulted in political upheaval. The ruling People's Party lost its majority and was replaced by the PSOE, whose leader, Zapatero, became prime minister. The new Spanish government withdrew troops from the US-led coalition in Iraq, with the last leaving the country in May 2004, only about 3 months after the attack. This move damaged Spain's international credibility. The Madrid attack is an example of terrorism being effective in terms of political violence leading to policy change in a democracy. Now, I will be passing the time to Isabella, who will be discussing the emergency response measures carried out during the crisis.
Thank you, Chloe. Now we will be assessing measures adopted to cope with the immediate aftermath of the crisis. Even though emergency response kicked in, it was only seemingly adequate. The Platicam Plan is an emergency response plan for Madrid that defines areas of responsibilities for responders from different government organizations working at local, regional, and national levels. However, these responsibilities, accorded to Emergency Medical Services, EMS, under the plan are unclear and open to interpretation. Hence, the command and control structure described in the plan was not followed, as we'll see later on. Here are the statistics of the manpower allocated for the bombing. Madrid 112 is a multi-service operation that integrates all emergency agencies to define the procedures that determine when each service must be activated. It functioned as an information center to which authorities and relatives could call for information about which hospitals the injured had been taken to. After the first call with information regarding initial explosions was received, an alarm report was already sent to SUMA 112 and Samoa, which was forwarded to the police, rescue service, and other relevant authorities. SUMA 112 is the organization responsible for coordinating medical emergency services in Madrid. On that day, a physician was appointed to coordinate the responses to the 4 incident sites, and specially appointed physicians were sent to the sites to report back. The role of Samoa is to quickly and efficiently resolve medical emergencies that occur on public roads within Madrid. Fire alarm concerning the explosions was received, and immediately, available personnel and equipment was sent. Soon after, a telephone chain was started. 11 people called in 400 staff within 30 minutes, and 600 volunteers were mobilized within 19 minutes. The Platicam flaws can be broken down into 2 components, vertical and horizontal agency coordination. There was a fundamental flaw in the Platicam plan. Since 1998, only one major written agreement has been introduced to help the main EMS operating in the region respond to daily emergencies. Its overall aim is to establish which medical service must respond to a given emergency, but does not set out responsibilities and procedures in the event of a major incident. Both SUMA 112 and Samoa considered themselves in charge of leading and coordinating medical work. SUMA 112 only coordinated alarm phases for medical responses, while Samoa had, in accordance with the organizational structure, responsibility for command at incident sites, which points to a lack of strategic communication. Moving on, for pre-transportation treatment, Samoa's control center held contact with incident sites and hospitals via a radio system used on a daily basis. However, there was no direct contact with hospital management, while reports showed that hospitals always had the capacity to receive more casualties. The failure of vertical agency coordination resulted in poor horizontal agency coordination, where people were unaware of reporting protocols. There were broad guidelines but unspecific instructions given, which resulted in the presence of numerous EMS managers and a lack of clear distribution of duties. For example, some performed medical procedures instead of assuming control or shifting between both duties. On SUMA's end, EMS wasn't aware of any general call-out procedure for major incidents. Members contacted the officers and went down on their own accord as they received no written or verbal instructions on where to report. Samoa's call-out procedure had many medics responding quickly, while many others contacted by friends or colleagues, leading to excess medics who were left idle. Prioritization of on-site facilities was misplaced when emergency responders focused on on-site treatment rather than transporting victims to hospitals. Assessing the weaknesses of response, there was a lack of overall plan for the distribution of casualties and emergency systems in hospitals. Treatment of victims was done on trains and platforms, which was extremely thoughtless and dangerous, as medical responders were unaware that an unexploded bomb remained in one of the carriages. In addition, casualty assembly points were set up within risk zones. Triage is an organized assessment of all victims to establish treatment and transport priorities. However, no triage was conducted despite equipment availability, as responders felt that the seriousness of injuries were easily recognizable, which led to over-triage at hospital entrance. Fortunately, all hospitals adopted appropriate measures to maximize surge capacity, and as the bombings occurred shortly before the start of a mid-week workday, most medical personnel were commuting to work or already on night shift duty. They managed to clear the ORs and were ready to receive casualties and provided decisive, adequate medical and surgical response. The two university hospitals, GMUGH and 12 October Hospital, are the closest with the largest capacity and provision for all forms of emergency care. Disaster Command decided to centralize all information for families and media in a building separate from the medical building, where a specific database system for the admitted casualties was created. These data were available online to other hospitals and health authorities, which became a great help to families in locating their loved ones. In summary, the ineffectiveness of the Platicam plan could be seen in poor vertical, horizontal agency coordination, coupled with a lack of triage, which eventually led to over-triage in hospitals. Now, I'll pass the time on to Alicia, who will expound on political holders' response.
The following segment utilizes Boyne's crisis leadership framework to evaluate the incumbent government's response to the bombing attacks. Key political figures include Prime Minister Asna and Interior Minister Acebes. The Interior Minister's portfolio covers domestic affairs, and consequently, Acebes was at the forefront of decision-making and communication efforts. The main issue with the incumbent's response is a premature termination of the crisis, of which the motivating factors and context will be analyzed in the following slides. Termination refers to a shift from emergency to routine. A crisis is mostly regarded as a temporary situation. As such, termination emphasizes regaining a sense of normalcy. Successful termination is contingent on the management of accountability processes. Leaders are expected to explain what went wrong, why, and what they did to limit the consequences of failure. Specifically, the onus is on regulators and managers to establish that they cannot be held responsible. There are three dimensions to the accountability process, namely severity, agency, and responsibility. The incumbent's failure in termination stems mainly from the adoption of an unconvincing blame strategy, where the loopholes in their argument were further exposed by media and the political opposition. The incumbent government was overly hasty in blaming ETA as the culprits of the attack. Despite ongoing investigation and inconclusive evidence, the administration placed an unfair emphasis on ETA in an attempt to shape public perceptions. The following timeline demonstrates some key points in press conferences and investigations. The very first press conference was held at 1 p.m. on the bombing day itself. This significantly set the tone of the administration, with Acebes giving concluding statements on the ETA's involvement, as can be seen from these quotes. Denial of ETA's responsibilities was dismissed as a poisoning, intolerable, and cheap statement. Questions about the types of explosive and possibility of Al-Qaeda intervention were all answered with respect to the ETA. At 2 p.m., Prime Minister Asna also held a press conference to call for unity as a nation. While he did not mention ETA by name, he had done so implicitly using a term like terrorist ban. The National Center for Intelligence did release a report attributing ETA as the most likely perpetrator. However, this was before evidence like the tape with Quran verses and the presence of a different dynamite were analyzed. We see a similar pattern unfold throughout the night and into day two. The cracks in the government's narrative became increasingly clear with conflicting media reports. Early on day two, political opposition like the PSOE and even the Basque regional government had called for more transparency. Around the same period, ETA had written into a Basque newspaper and explicitly denied their involvement. Even then, both Asna and Acebes insisted on the ETA framing. The incumbent's hastiness in blaming ETA needs to be understood in its political context. With the national elections around the corner, An ETA attack would serve the administration's political agenda well. The Conservative Party had successfully built its election campaign on adopting a more hardline stance against domestic terrorism. For instance, in year 2000, an agreement designing several counter-terrorism measures received non-partisan support. It outlined stricter measures against ETA and over the years has shown remarkable impact. In 2003, ETA only launched 18 attacks with 3 fatalities, their lowest figure in 30 years. ETA terrorism in public agenda also took a sharp dive, indicating that the public had generally considered the threat to be eliminated. On the other hand, if Al-Qaeda were the culprits of the attack, it would have reflected horribly on the conservative administration. Aznar was a key international ally of then US President George Bush. His decision to back the Iraq War was highly unpopular among the Spanish population, as mentioned before. Just a month before the Madrid bombing, there were large-scale anti-war demonstrations in over 57 Spanish cities. Premature termination also stems from a failure to fulfill other crisis management tasks. The first one being early recognition, or can be known simply as foresight. It involves continuous vigilance, shared awareness that something can happen at any given moment, and a willingness to act on faint signals. Spain's internal security structure, while effective in targeting ETA, was inadequate in facing the threats of global terrorism. With the 9/11 attacks in the US and the 2003 Moroccan bombing, it was clear that jihadist terrorism networks were spreading throughout the world, and Spain was no exception. While this phenomenon was not unknown, it was not prioritized, nor were there sufficient resources allocated for officials to carry out their work. Aznar himself acknowledged this lack of foresight in his book, mentioning that the very successes achieved against ETA in recent years may have led us to lower our guard against the fundamentalist threat. Similarly, poor meaning-making premises the failed termination. According to Boyne and his colleagues, meaning-making is defined as the attempt to reduce public and political uncertainty and inspire confidence in crisis leaders by formulating and imposing a convincing narrative. The incumbent initially fared well in doing so. By calling a nationwide demonstration under the slogan, "With the victims, with the Constitution for defeating terrorism," the People's Party was successful in uniting the country in mourning for the lives lost. This was helpful in instilling confidence in the party's leadership capabilities. However, this quickly fell apart with their inability to establish an information initiative. Led by a political agenda and personal biases, Aznar's administration was unable to consider both the ETA and the jihadists as possible culprits. As mentioned earlier, the second inquiry by the police quickly revealed growing evidence for jihadist involvement. This led to a circulation of rumors in the media and on the ground. Calls for transparency by the political opposition further fanned the flames for growing distrust in the government's narrative. On the same day of this discovery, an Al-Qaeda affiliate had claimed responsibility, though there was no way to authenticate the latter. All in all, Aznar's administration had failed in both recognizing the threat and providing authoritative accounts of the crisis. All this contributed to their failure in terminating the crisis at an appropriate juncture. Judy will now be sharing on our team's overall evaluation.
Thank you, Alicia. I will now move on to the overall evaluation of the Spain's termination for the Madrid train bombing. It will be split into the evaluation of the emergency response and the evaluation of the office holders' response. Firstly, the emergency response was done well in terms of the damage control and the immediate response of various stakeholders. Provided that the attack caught Spain off-guarded, the response was very efficient. The emergency services arrived within 15 minutes once the explosion happened. Rescue and damage control began instantly when relevant organizations received news of the bombing. Within 3 hours, all victims were evacuated from the bombing site to receive treatment, and arrangement for the deceased was organized. The response was based on an established national emergency plan, which provided the various stakeholders guidelines for action, allowing them to perform their duties in the shortest time period. The good damage control can also be attributed to the large infrastructures nearby and the extensive healthcare system that Madrid has. Infrastructure such as the Park Ferrell John Carlos I Exhibition Center was transformed into a makeshift morgue and chapel for those that do not require urgent medical care to rest. The hospitals that the survivors were rushed to were also established hospitals that are highly capable to deal with the large surge capacity from the bomb attack. Although there were still flaws in the emergency response, the response was well done as it minimized the damage to the lowest, as seen by the low death rate, by efficiently employing all usable manpower and resources. However, the immediate crisis termination is not representative of the crisis leadership of the Spain's government. The effective response is mainly attributed to the luck that Spain got during the crisis. The emergency response was mainly conducted by various stakeholders, such as the hospital, SAMUR, etc. Spain was lucky to have vacant infrastructures at that point to shelter the victims temporarily. And they are extremely lucky to have an extensive healthcare system, which just nice to be at the peak functioning period during the crisis, such as the Gregorio Morono Hospital, where they have ample staff because of the change of shift and extensive healthcare supplies that include operating rooms to handle the surge capacity. During the emergency response, the government was actually unprepared and slow in their response. Partial credit can be given to the government for the emergency plan. However, the emergency plan by the government was flawed as it lacked comprehensiveness and it failed to provide detailed instructions. The plan also lacked an overall command to overlook and coordinate all stakeholders. This caused the stakeholders to run their own programs instead of working together to achieve maximum efficiency. The government was also slow in appointing a regional command, leading to the pro-crisis communication between the organizations on site. Luckily, the hospitals were capable to handle the overtriage that was caused by the poor crisis communication. This prevented further casualties that may be caused by overcrowding in the hospital. Thus, although the emergency response was excellent in terms of efficiency, it is not representative of the government's crisis leadership, as they are slow and unprepared in the response, and it is mainly the hospitals carrying the entire emergency response. Next, the political office holders' response also lacks transparency to the people. After the crisis, the government is supposed to provide emotional reassurance and support to the public, especially the directly impacted citizens, to ensure domestic peace and that life is back to normal. The Spanish government did extremely poorly by providing inaccurate information about the terrorists to be the ETA as mentioned by Alicia. Instead of reassuring the public, the government misled the victims in an attempt to restore legitimacy and terminate the crisis before the political elections. They failed to consider the emotional damage to the citizens and only focused on the party's political gains. The false hope that was given to the citizens makes them think that the threat has been terminated, and in this lowered their vigilance when the danger is actually still lurking beside them. The unhealed wounds of the victim family was also aggravated as they thought that justice had been served. The inaccurate information from the government resulted in a second damage to the citizen. This also crushed Azlar's party's political accountability to the citizens, increasing the tension as the citizens no longer trust the government anymore. This resulted in a series of flash mob protests by the citizens on 13 March, demanding the truth from the government, and the subsequent fall of the Azlar's party during the political elections. All in all, Spain's government did poorly in the termination during the Madrid train bombing. Although there were positive results during the emergency response, it was not reflective of the Spanish government's leadership. The termination from the office holders was a mess, and it caused many unwanted results that further complicated and deteriorated the situation. Now, I'll pass the time to Nicolette to talk about the lessons learned from the 11M.
Thank you, Judy. Although Spain did poorly in the intermediate critical task, as mentioned earlier by my group mates, they performed well in the last critical task of lessons learned. As seen from the slide, lessons learned refer to the lessons drawn from the crisis for contingency planning and training to prevent a similar incident from happening again. Ever since 2004, Spain has not experienced another terrorist crisis of this scale, allowing us to infer that the lessons drawn from the 2004 Madrid train bombings have been effective in helping Spain prevent the recurrence of a similar tragedy. We divided this section into two parts: what Spain did/can learn, and what we can learn from the crisis. The first lesson that Spain learned was regarding the inefficiencies in their emergency response infrastructure. As Isabella mentioned earlier, the on-site emergency response was lacking in terms of coordination, as agencies had their own perceptions of themselves as the leading hero. Off-duty responders were unaware of the reporting protocol, and on-site responders did not even know who their command leader was. What a disaster. Imagine not knowing the professor you're supposed to submit your assignments to. In this vein, Spain learned that they needed better vertical, interagency, and horizontal, intra-agency coordination in order to have a more cohesive emergency response. These include having distinguishable command leaders, specific reporting protocols so that off-duty responders who are activated can easily access the incident site and jump into action, and to possess a cohesive perception of themselves as a collective emergency response unit. The next area of improvement in terms of emergency response would be the prioritization of emergency transportation instead of on-site treatment facilities. The shoddy triage and not to mention dangerous nature of the on-site treatment facilities led to numerous problems for the hospital staff, such as over-triage and administrative disasters, as people were arriving by ambulances, private vehicles, and some were even walking. When a bomb explodes, the first thing you think of is to run and get away from the site of danger as soon as possible. Given this natural instinct, greater prioritization should be placed on the transportation of survivors to the hospitals to ensure the safety of victims and to ensure a linear line of triage and communication between first responders and hospital staff. The next lesson Spain learned is that global terrorism is real. This may sound intuitive to most of us, especially after the presentation by last week's group on the 9/11 attacks and the war on terror. But it seemed that it took Spain its own first-hand experience of terrorism for them to be awoken to the insidious reality of it. Fortunately, Spain learned this lesson rather quickly, a couple of weeks in fact, and established the National Anti-Terrorism Coordination Center. Over the years, Spain has continued to increase and fine-tune their anti-terrorism measures, as seen from the increase in manpower, and venture into the world of technology to deal with the evolving nature of terrorism. Last week, I asked a question during the seminar on whether countries can ever learn somewhat foolproof lessons from crises, seeing the evolving nature of terrorism. As seen from the 2017 terror attack in Spain, where terrorists were literally mowing down pedestrians like it was Grand Theft Auto, the answer seems to be no. However, given the current era of terrorism we seem to be in, cyber terrorism and still relevant bombings, Spain has evidently learned their lesson and are trying their best to improve on their previously inadequate intelligence on international terrorist groups. The next lesson is for all of us, and that is on transparency. Often we see politicians not believing in the honesty is the best policy mantra, as somehow they perceive honest admission of one's fallibility as a kind of image destruction mechanism. But the funny thing is, most of them end up regretting their acts of deception, which shows how telling the truth could have been a better option. As such, our group feels that governments should learn how to accept that they are in fact human, and experiencing uncertainty during a crisis is perfectly normal. What would distinguish a strong government response from a weak government response would be the way in which they communicate their efforts to then resolve and emerge from this uncertainty. In fact, for Asna, this admission of uncertainty could have even worked in his favor, as the introduction of global terrorism would not have hampered his electoral campaign of stamping out terrorism, but in fact strengthen it, as it tells the Spanish people of his sensitivity to international developments and all-encompassing direction for Spain moving forward. Although the Madrid train bombings occurred in 2004, a nascent time for social media, and where traditional media was still heavily dependent on in crisis communications, this case study still remains relevant in reminding us of the importance of transparency. Imagine, if back then the speed of traditional media could expose the misguided accusations on ETA in less than 2 days after the attack, the destruction that such an expose could do today would be unfathomable. Nevertheless, social media also always carries the propensity to misconstrue and distort the truth, as seen from the 2017 Manchester attacks, where ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack, but was strangely unable to get the details of their master plan right. In short, transparency in crisis communication is very much heightened, and is believed by our group to be the only foolproof way for governments to insulate themselves from any backlash in terms of crisis communication. This is because even in the worst case scenario, political parties or governments can never be accused of deceiving the people and not trying their best. Thank you.